Hello, I am Thomas Porteous and you're watching another episode of Xplained. Today we look at US military interventions across the world. Let's get straight into it. On the 3rd of January of 2026, US President Donald Trump announced that the United States had successfully completed Operation Absolute Resolve, a coordinated mission to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores. The operation capped months of secret planning by US military and intelligence agencies. The US accuses captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro of running a corrupt and illegitimate government powered by a massive drug trafficking operation that flooded the United States with cocaine for years. Maduro is charged alongside with his wife Celia Flores, his son, and 3 other alleged co-conspirators. The indictment lists 4 major counts against Maduro, including narco-terrorism, conspiracy, cocaine importation, conspiracy and possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to possess those weapons. But this is not the first time the United States has invaded a country. The United States has been involved in hundreds of interventions in foreign countries throughout its history, engaging in nearly 400 military interventions between 1776 and this year. Half of those operations have occurred since 1950, and over 25% occurred in the first post-Cold War period. Common objectives of US foreign interventions have historically resolved around economic opportunity, protection of US citizens and diplomats, territorial expansion, counterterrorism, fomenting regime, promoting democracy, and enforcing international law. The 19th century formed the roots of the United States' foreign interventionism, which at the time was largely driven by economic opportunities in the Pacific and Spanish-held Latin America, along with the Monroe Doctrine, which saw the US seek a policy to resist European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. But what is this doctrine? The Monroe Doctrine has been used over time as a broad justification for US foreign interventions, especially in Latin America. The doctrine was initially a defensive statement, and it warned European powers against new colonization or interference in the Western Hemisphere, while the United States promised not to interfere in European affairs. It did not authorize US intervention in Latin America. Although the doctrine spoke only to European actions, later US leaders recast it as giving Washington a special responsibility to police the hemisphere. The mid-19th century, President James K. Polk used Monroe principles to justify US expansion westward. European opposition to US expansion was framed as a violation of the doctrine, effectively using it to shield American territorial ambitions. The most significant development came in 1904 when Theodore Roosevelt declared that the United States had the right to intervene in Latin American countries suffering from chronic instability or wrongdoing. This turned the doctrine into a justification for direct military occupation and regime control. Now let's briefly look at some of the US interventions in Latin America and how they impacted the respective nations. In 1954, the CIA backed a coup in Guatemala that toppled elected President Jacobo Arbenz after land reforms affected US corporate interests, setting off decades of violence and military rule. In Cuba, after Fidel Castro overthrew a US-backed dictator, Batista, in 1959, American efforts to remove him culminated in the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, pushing Havana closer to the Soviet Union. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the United States supported or tolerated military coups in Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, and Uruguay, backing regimes that promised anti-communist order but often ruled through repression. In the Dominican Republic and Grenada, US troops were deployed directly, justified by fears of leftist governments taking power close to American shores. Central America became a major front in the 1980s, with the US pouring military aid into El Salvador and supporting Contra rebels in Nicaragua, despite widespread reports of human rights abuses. In Panama, in 1989, American forces invaded to remove strongman Manuel Noriega, reasserting control over a strategic partner and the Canal Zone. But US interventions are not just limited to Latin America. Let's break down other major US invasions in the past. We start, of course, with Iraq. The United States intervened in Iraq in 2003 following years of tensions, suspicions, and unresolved conflicts that dated back to the First Gulf War. After Iraq invaded Kuwait in the 1990s, a US-led coalition drove Iraqi forces out, but the war did not remove Saddam Hussein from power. Instead, the United Nations imposed strict sanctions and ordered Iraq to destroy all weapons of mass destruction, including chemical, biological, and nuclear programs. For years, UN weapons inspectors monitored Iraq, but by 1988, Saddam suspended cooperation, prompting US and British airstrikes. This deepened Washington's belief that Iraq was hiding banned weapons. Iraq was branded part of an axis of evil, and in October 2002, the US Congress authorized the use of force. Washington sought UN backing but failed to secure approval from the Security Council, with France, Germany, and others calling for more inspections. Despite this, the US formed a coalition of the willing, led by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. On March the 20th, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom began. Nearly 300,000 US and allied troops invaded Iraq across its border with Kuwait. Within weeks, Iraq's military collapsed. Baghdad fell and Saddam Hussein's regime was toppled. Saddam went into hiding but was captured by US forces in December 2003 near his hometown of Tikrit. He was later tried by an Iraqi court and executed in public in 2006. However, the central justification for the war, weapons of mass destruction, never materialized. None were ever found. One of the more recent invasions is that of Libya. The United States intervened in Libya in 2011 during the height of the Arab Spring, as protests against the long-time leader Muammar Gaddafi turned into a full-blown civil war. The official justification was humanitarian. The Obama administration, backed by the United Nations, said military action was necessary to protect civilians after Gaddafi threatened to crush uprisings in rebel-held cities. The UN Security Council authorized a no-fly zone and airstrikes to prevent attacks on civilian populations, but very quickly the mission expanded. NATO airstrikes targeted Libyan government forces, command centers, and military assets, tilting the balance in favor of rebel groups. Western leaders increasingly made it clear that any end to the conflict required Gaddafi to step down. The United States and its allies also argued that intervening in Libya would send a message to other authoritarian leaders that mass violence against protesters that would not be tolerated. At the same time, Washington backed the Libyan rebels, describing their leadership as pro-democracy and a potential path to a new political future. In October 2011, Gaddafi was captured and killed by rebel forces, effectively ending his 4-decade rule. Next we go to Afghanistan. The United States intervened in Afghanistan in 2001 following the September 11th attacks on New York and Washington. According to the US, Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, planned and launched those attacks from Afghanistan, where it was being sheltered by the Taliban regime. At the same time, the Taliban controlled most of the country and refused to hand over bin Laden despite international pressure. With near unanimous support from the US, Congress, and backed NATO allies, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom in October 2001. The initial goal was to destroy Al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban from power, and prevent Afghanistan from remaining a safe haven for terror groups. Within weeks, the Taliban government collapsed and a new interim administration was installed under Hamid Karzai with United Nations support. But the war did not end there. As Al-Qaeda leaders escaped and the Taliban regrouped, the mission expanded. The US and NATO shifted towards nation building, training Afghan security forces, supporting democratic elections and rebuilding a country devastated by decades of war. Over time, the conflict turned into a prolonged insurgency. Taliban attacks resurged, civilian casualties rose, and questions grew about corruption, governance, and the sustainability of the Afghan state. After 20 years of fighting, trillions of dollars spent, and thousands of lives lost, the United States ended its military presence in 2001, and the Taliban returned to power. Lastly, we look at Vietnam. The United States did not enter the Vietnam War overnight. Its involvement grew, gradually driven by a mix of history, ideology, and a fear of communism spreading across Asia. Vietnam had been a French colony before World War II, and during the war, Japan occupied the country and a communist-led resistance movement. The Vietnamese fought for independence under their leader, Ho Chi Minh. After Japan's defeat, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam independent in 1945. France tried to reclaim control, but lost a decisive battle in 1954. A peace deal at Geneva split Vietnam temporarily along the 17th parallel with Communist North and Capitalist South. National elections were promised but never held. Civil war soon followed, but communist fighters in the south, known as the National Liberation Front, began attacking the southern government. Many South Vietnamese people supported them, unhappy with their leader NGO, Diem, who was corrupt, unpopular, and repressed the Buddhist majority. US leaders believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. With China already communist and North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, the United States decided it had to act. By 1963, more than 16,000 American advisors were in South Vietnam. After Diem was overthrown, the South grew even more unstable. Then the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. After reported attacks on US naval ships, Congress gave President Lyndon Johnson broad powers to use military force. By 1965, US combat troops were on the ground. What followed was a full-scale war, one that would last a decade, cost billions of dollars, and claim the lives of more than 58,000 Americans, all rooted in the fear of communism and the struggle for control in Cold War Asia. The Monroe Doctrine has a long, controversial sticking point in US foreign policy. With the latest attack on Venezuela and the capture of Nicolas Maduro, Trump has now coined the phrase Donroe Doctrine. From the Monroe Doctrine to the so-called Donroe Doctrine, the United States has long asserted its influence across the world. Each action has drawn criticism, with allies and rivals alike questioning the legal and moral basis. Now, with Operation Absolute Resolve, the United States shows it is willing to use military force directly to achieve strategic objectives, reinforcing a century-old legacy of intervention that many still argue shapes international relations today. And that is all that we have time for on this episode of Xplained. Stay tuned with more in-depth insights and stories that matter. Thank you.